talking about capital, we're talking about how the people who run the capital or own the capital find the best ideas to invest in. So let me quickly run you through a couple of concepts that we're going to be touching upon in this conversation. The first thing is the size of the opportunity. Is it scalable? Can it grow from 1 to 10? And can you see that happen over a course of time or through a timeline? Is it saleable? The proposition, does the conviction and rigor of it come across when you sit across the table and talk to the promoter? Do you feel the excitement and vigor of what it is that he or she is presenting? And of course, the execution capability. Does this have the potential to become the next Flipkart, the next Snapdeal, or the next big idea really in the Indian landscape? Just to put it into perspective in terms of numbers, we are talking about the second largest internet user base in the world. That's a sense of the potential that we've got going over here. But the big question is, what are PE funds doing right now? Or whether it's seed capital or angel investors, really, how are they going about looking at this idea? Are they looking at the omni-channel sector in the long run? And are they looking at both from the investor's point of view and the investee's point of view? Because there have been some burnt fingers that we all know about that has hogged a lot of press and limelight over the last couple of months. Are the right funding, are the right ventures getting the right funding? Is the best person meeting the best idea really? That's a couple of issues that we're going to touch upon, and this is most importantly about the money. So anyone who's in e-tail and wants to be the next Snapdeal, you can just raise your hand. Let me invite on stage all the people who will discuss and debate that. Alok Goyal, who's MD Safe Partners, will be joining in with his thoughts. Atul Goyal, who's Managing Director, eCity Ventures. Bharat Banka, who's founder and ex-CEO, Aditya Birla Private Equity. Darpan Sanghvi, who's the founder of myglam.com. K. Vetishwaran, who's founder of indiaplaza.com and is also an e-commerce entrepreneur. He's a visionary and a mentor. Rishabh Soni, who's MD of SSIPL. Sandeep Sharma, who's co-founder of yepme.com. And of course, the session is being moderated by Pichu Kurian, who's a member of the Strategic Advisory Board and mentor of L Capital Asia. Welcome on board, gentlemen. Alok, you had a bunch of great ideas yesterday and you left a lot of thought for everyone to discuss. So today you're going to tell us the straight path and the 1, 2, 3 step process to get to snapdeal.com, or that kind of valuation perhaps. Take it away, gentlemen.
So thank you, and very good morning to all you ladies and gentlemen. The aim is not to create a Snapdeal at the end of this conversation.
No one's told me.
The aim hopefully is to be able to better understand investments from a private equity or a VC fund's perspective. It's not that I claim to be an expert on this. I've only got recently involved in this entire game, but I think what we have here in this group is a set of people who've been in the private equity business, those who've also been on the other side of the private equity business in terms of receiving funds, built businesses, built value, hopefully exited some of those investments, and are looking forward to, fancy exits in the future. Let me kind of give you a brief about how we intend to run this session. What I'll do is I'll take about 5-7 minutes to just cover the entire investment space and give you a macro backdrop of what the investment space is looking like in India over the last 10 to 15 years. Post that, then what we will try and do is to have an engaging discussion amongst all of us panelists and hopefully throw open the session to the audience for questions. We might pepper the session with questions in between. So it's not that we're going to be waiting right till the end to ask questions. We'll stop maybe somewhere in between when we feel suitably fatigued and ask you for a few questions and then come back again to the panel and then again a set of questions at the end. The theme of the session is the power of capital and the India opportunity promise. And when you really look at that and look at what we define as private equity or venture capital, but when you look at equity, which is money invested in the equity capital or sometimes also in the debt capital of a company, and this is classically an operating company, and these are companies which are not quoted on a stock exchange because which they're defined as private companies. And because they're private companies and you're putting in private investment, it might be more formal through a private equity fund. We call all of that as being part of the private equity space. So when you look at private equity and look at what's happened in India over the last 10 to 15 years, a fair amount of money seems to have come into this country. Approximately about, if I were to go by a McKinsey estimate, approximately about $103, $104 billion has come into, private investment in private companies over the last 14 years. There's been a build-up over the last year or so, and this year, looking at the current rates till the end of July, what it does seem is that we are likely to be having a bumper year in terms of equity investments. It looks like approximately about $12 billion or $13 billion would get invested this year, which is pretty much in line with what's happened in the year 2008, when we had about $14 billion invested in the market. In the last few years, what you're also seeing is that there is a larger and more increasing role that this form of financing is playing in the larger equity financing of companies. And in the last 4 years, about 50% or 45% to be exact, has been the quantum of investment made by private equity in all equity financing in this country. And if you look at where this money has been invested, more than 50% of the money invested in the last 4 years has actually been invested in what we define as large corporates, which is today about 750 crores plus in terms of top line, in terms of revenue. So more than 50% of the monies have been invested in that segment of companies. And this segment contributes only 20% of the total number of deals which have happened in the equity space in the last 4 years. So what you can see here is that while there is a fair amount of money going into large companies in terms of equity investment, there are a large number of deals happening with a whole bunch of small investments. So small companies which are less than about 500 crores are gobbling up a large proportion of the deals in terms of numbers, but yet only 50% of the monies that are getting invested. But if you were to reflect back on all of this investment that has happened in India in this space in the last 15 years, what you can see is that in the early years, and especially in the years 2005 to 2008, investments were in the region of returns were in the region of approximately 40 to 50% in dollar terms. But unfortunately, for a variety of reasons which a lot of us are familiar with, in the last couple of years, returns have dramatically dropped. And in the last 2 years, in dollar terms, returns have dropped to as low as between 8 to 10%. So there is some stress in the private equity industry in terms of generating adequate returns, especially because of a rapidly depreciating rupee. Secondly, because of greater competition, which is there. Thirdly, if this greater competition translates into higher valuations. And then, of course, there is a macro environment, which is the country and the consumer industry, which certainly has not been able to generate the kind of performances which would justify significant returns. Holding periods have also increased. So earlier, people were quite happy saying that, my time horizon is 3 to 5 years. But today, what we see is that the time horizon has to get suitably extended to at least 6 to 7 years before you can actually see a company having been invested in actually realizing value back for the investor. Third is that if you look at the period of 2000 to 2008, and if you look at that being the investment horizon, and then if you look at the period which is 2009 to 2014, which is what we might define as the exit horizon, what you do see is of the large amounts of money, approximately about $50 billion which got invested between 2000 and 2008, only about $16 billion out of that actually exited in the period subsequent to 2008. And even this $16 billion exited at returns which were not very flattering, especially when you compare to the kind of returns that funds like this normally get in China, got a 1.7x on an average. But the biggest concern is the fact that only 16% actually officially exited. Of course, there are sectoral challenges. Real estate has been a challenge. Real estate currently, which at least in the period 2000-2008, took away about 20% of that $51 billion, actually produced miserable returns of approximately 2%, and the exits were also a huge challenge. Even in the telecom space, certainly there was a challenge in terms of both the returns as well as in terms of exits. The consumer space was probably better from two reasons. One, of course, the average returns were better than the average for all sectors. That's one part of it. The second part of it is that the exit period also was much shorter. So while on the average you had about 7 years, 6.5 to 7 years in terms of holding, in the consumer sector the average holding was about between 3.5 to 4 years. So what you can see is that there's one part of investment, which is investing and making sure that you make the right choices when investing. And there's a second part of investing, which is in terms of realizing the value, which is where you look for in terms of an exit horizon. So while there might be great opportunities to invest, what we also know is that nothing is realized in terms of value till you exit as a private equity player. And so when you look at that, and you look at some of the trends which seem to be happening, one of the things that we all know is when there is buoyancy in the market, there is buoyancy all around. So if there is a stock market which is growing by, let's say, if you look at the last year, it went up 35% before it dropped. What you can see is that when a stock market produces that kind of a performance, you certainly find a lot of private equity players also seemingly interested in the same market because they believe that what the public companies are doing, it shouldn't be far before the private companies actually reflect the same performance. So there tends to be a herd mentality. And what does that herd mentality translate to? That herd mentality translates to the fact that a lot more companies then get focused on investing in India as a country. A lot more funds are available. If the number of investable opportunities are not enough, then there is more funds chasing some of these investable opportunities, which means that valuations then start skyrocketing. When valuations start skyrocketing, then return expectations start getting muted. When expectations, even if they don't get muted, the reality of returns is that returns then get muted because your entry valuations have been too high. So this is an area which again we see as a challenge. The second is that the way equity players exit from companies has also been changing. In the early years, especially in the first 7-8 years of 2000, most of the exits seemingly were to strategic players. Those who are in the same line of business, interested in buying into an Indian company, or even a larger Indian company buying into a smaller Indian company. But what we are beginning to see, especially over the last 3-4 years, and probably reflective of the larger economic environment in this country, is that most of the deals now seem to be happening through either sale to other equity players, which is a trade sale, or through hopefully an IPO, or through, again, a secondary issue. So these seem to be some of the changes that are happening in terms of the way people are exiting. Fund managers who've been around for long enough, and that of course is sometimes a bit difficult to find, because the average tenure of a fund manager is also getting shorter, and the tenure of a fund manager in a single country like India is also not very long. So because of which, when you look at fund managers, and hopefully having been around long enough, they've learned their lessons. Nowadays, what they prefer to do is to look at quality promoters. And that is becoming something which is quite important. How do we finally trust the promoter in as much as you trust the investment that you're making in that company? And we all know that finally at the end of the day, unless you're doing a majority deal, you're actually trusting a promoter. And you've got to trust a promoter to be able to deliver on the promises that they're making to you when you make that investment. The second is in terms of making sure that you increase your control, and which is the reason why a lot more preference is today being made on taking majority deals, and which then changes the perspective that you bring into an investment from merely being a significant minority player influencing some things to becoming a majority player and influencing the entire operation of the company. Third is that fund managers also realize that exits are not easy. And since exits are not easy, they define what is known as a liquidity discount that you need to put into the market. And when you define a liquidity discount, it takes into effect the fact that your entry valuations have to be suitably downgraded. When you look at what promoters are expecting, and if you looked at, say, 15 years back, and look at the role of private equity 15 years back, there weren't so many funds, there weren't so many companies which are actually getting funded by private equity players, and consequently promoters didn't really know what to expect from this animal called a private equity. So now over the last 15 years, there's been some amount of experience of the involvement of private equity players within companies. So when you look at it from a promoter's perspective, certainly some of the things that they're looking at is in terms of making sure that, if there's a private equity involvement in their company, how do they make sure that that player improves the performance of the board of the company? So go away all of the sisters and the brothers and the uncles and the cousins who normally tend to populate a board, and then you start getting in people who can actually add value to the company itself. One, of course, from an equity perspective, second, from an operational perspective. So the composition of boards tend to reflect the fact that, if you get a private equity player, then the promoter expects that the board will play a more important role in the running of the company. Second thing is that they expect private equity players to do what normally tends to be a problem with a lot of the promoters, which is that the perspective tends to be operational and for the immediate, as opposed to taking a much longer term perspective and understanding the company from a more strategic perspective. And I think what does happen is that once private equity players get involved in these companies, promoters expect them to be able to lend and add value in terms of bringing a more strategic perspective to the thinking and deliberations of both the board as well as the promoter. Third is that they expect them to be having a network. So if there is a requirement to be able to make sure that you professionalize the management of the company, then that's another area that promoters expect the equity players to be doing. The last, of course, is that given the connects that several private equity players have, what tends to happen is that there is a greater expectation that expansion plus opportunities for strategic alliances will increase when a private equity player gets invested into a company. So these are just a few thoughts that I thought I'd share with you before we throw open this the discussion to the panel that we have here. What I'd like to first do is to request each of the panel members to introduce themselves so that all of you know where they're coming in from. Are they coming in from a private equity perspective? Are they coming in from a promoter perspective? Are they coming in from a corporate perspective? So that gives you some understanding of each of them. And the second part of after that is when I will field a few questions to them, and hopefully we will get a lot of bright answers, and then we will request you all also to field a few questions to the panel. So can I request, starting from the other end, Sandeep, can you please introduce yourself? Introduce yourself by name, tell us about your company, and what your expectations from this audience are.
I'm Sandeep Sharma, I'm co-founder of Yepme. So I'm coming from a mixed perspective basically. So I was thinking through the presentation and I was looking at, should I represent one group or the other? So I'm co-founder of Yepme. We started this online fashion company about 5 years back. So I'll be more inclined towards spending time on sharing my experience on the fundraise and to the point where we have reached today and board dynamics and entry exit and the conflicts and common interests. And I think I should be adding a lot of value in that area.
Thanks. Rishabh?
Thank you. Morning. I'm Rishabh Soni from SSIPL. We are basically retail partners, franchise partners for international brands, partners for brands like Nike, Levi's, Lotto in the country. So we are in the brick and mortar retailing business. And I'm assuming I'm representing the promoter's perspective on this panel.
Thank you. Alok?
I'm part of Saif Partners, which is a venture capital firm in the country. We have invested in firms like Paytm, Home Shop 18, Urban Ladder, kind of the companies. And I'm a very new venture capitalist. Before that, I was Chief Executive Officer, CEO of Freecharge, which we sold to Snapdeal. And prior to that, I was Chief Operating Officer of Redbus, which we sold to Naspers. So I'm actually a guy who is more of an entrepreneur than an investor. I tend to wear both the hats.
Vaidhi.
My name is Vaidishwaran. I actually am a retail entrepreneur for a long time. I founded India's first e-commerce company, India Plaza, in 1999. I also co-founded a chain of grocery stores called Fab Mall, which was subsequently acquired by the Aditya Birla Group and is rebranded as More. I currently mentor a whole lot of startups, invest into startups in the area of retail, e-commerce, and omni-channel. I also work and represent Deloitte in their digital transformation and omni-channel strategies consulting with large brands. So I'm here actually to speak the truth and share some of the perspectives that may be controversial. Nobody wants to talk about, so if there's an opportunity, I'm here to speak the truth.
Titan, and way back in 2002, when Vaidhi used to run India Plaza, we figured out that payment gateways were charging too much, 7% in those days. And since he had already negotiated a good deal, I went to him and I said that, we want to sell Titan watches online, so can you help us by, selling it on your website? So you just be the payment gateway and let the customer believe that all the commerce is happening from the Titan website. So that was my first association with Vaidhi, and in the early days of e-commerce. Bharat?
Hi, I'm Bharat Banka. Around 20 years back, I started my career as an investment banker with ICICI and JP Morgan. And after that, I shifted to the corporate side. I was there with Aditya Birla Group for almost 20 years, doing various roles. Initially, I started with the banking and finance business and then moved into the corporate role, ran businesses, I think did multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions and restructurings, organized funding, so on the fundraise side for the corporate. After that, for last 6-7 years, I set up their private equity business, raised money for private equity, invested in lots of very interesting, mid-stage companies. Some of the ones very successfully in consumer space. And for last 3 or 4 months' time, now I'm on my own, and I'm advising some of the corporates and the fund houses on what I have learned for last 20 years. And in addition, I think as just Vaidhi said, some of the startups, I have been sort of seeding investments with them and mentoring them. So if I can say, I have been all sides of the table, and I'll be happy to share all the pains and the gains, I think, around the table. Thank you.
Thanks, Bharat. Atul?
Hi, I'm Atul Goyal. Till recently, I stood on an entertainment retail company called Fun Cinemas. So after 15 years, we made a successful exit to a Mexican chain called Cinepolis. Having done that, now I think what really takes a lot of my time is I'm basically turned into an angel investor. So I'm looking at several e-commerce and tech companies. What I'm here to share today is maybe my early views on what sort of companies are good, or what should be the right thing companies should be doing, and what shouldn't they be doing. And these are my early views, and I'm happy to share with you what the initial thoughts are.
Hi, I'm Darpan Sangui. I'm the founder of myglam.com. MyGlam is a marketplace for on-demand salon and spa services at your doorstep. Our company is fairly young, probably the youngest company on this panel. So I'm here to share the trials and tribulations of scaling up, which a lot of these other guys have already achieved.
Thanks. Darpan, if I may address my first question to you, and I know you run this online service called MyGlam, which is a marketplace. One of the things that normally tends to happen is that everybody keeps seeking what you might define as a differentiated model, okay? And one of the things that everybody knows about differentiated model is nobody's really chased that differentiated model, because obviously the visible potential seems to be low. Yet on the other hand, from an investor's perspective, they all look for differentiated models because that then stands out from the crowd, and hopefully you have a first mover advantage. So can you just share with the audience and with some of us the thoughts that went through your mind when you decided to start a marketplace for online beauty services, where I can log on to your site and make sure somebody comes in, not have a haircut, but at least a shave?
I was running salons and spas offline, and a few months ago I was in the US and I saw a concept called a Glam Squad, where I saw they were sending hairdressers at home. Now, over the years, when I was running salons and spas, I saw my customers coming and telling my stylist, "Arey, can you come home on your day off?" And the stylist saying, "Yeah, I'll come and I'll give you the service for half the price." So the consumer behavior was already there, both on the artist side, that's the supply, and the consumer side. We just decided to enable it. When I saw that, I fell off the bar stool. I was in New York and I said, why haven't I thought of this? Started making the calls from there, and this happened in April. And then from April to July, we launched the services, and it's taken off well. When you said differentiated model, so this vertical by itself, providing hair and beauty services at home, has existed in a very fragmented way, unorganized way. We figured out what are the consumer challenges: discovery, credibility, availability. Let's go address them. And the differentiated model will come there in addressing the challenges that the consumer faces. So far, most of our hypothesis has proven right. We started services in Bombay, taken off really well. Now we started them in Pune as well. Did I answer your question on?
Yeah. So can I have a follow-on question? Probably I'll just ask Alok this question, because he's been involved with both Redbus and Freecharge. And again, in some senses, when you really looked at it, it was a need. Yet on the other hand, there was no existing model. So when Redbus came in, it was the first of its kind. And in some ways, like Darpan talked about, it tried to organize an unorganized market, and it tried to create convenience for an inconvenient service. So one of the big challenges which are there is that while we all know that there is a felt need, the cost of actually making sure that that need gets known to the customer often overwhelms you, and tends to then, you tend to ask yourself questions: is it worth investing so much in order to change consumer attitudes and behaviors towards what is actually a genuine cause to chase?
So 2 points here. I think first and foremost, it's probably problem of having English as a secondary language for us. I think the right word to use is actually a defensible model, not differentiated model, which is where a lot of confusion comes up. So I can always say this is a differentiated model, and I'm doing this small little thing which is different than what everyone else is doing, and hence I'm a differentiated model. I should get a lot of funding, I should become a big business, but that doesn't make it as a big business, because the business needs to be defensible. And just to say it in one more line, every defensible business is differentiable business, but not every differentiable business is a defensible business. And that's a very important distinction to keep in mind. So always look for a defensible business, not differentiated business. That should be the goal. And in the end, about the point of cost of reaching out to customers to make them aware that I'm solving your need. At the end of the day, in a technology-driven business, the first and foremost requirement for any business is that it should be having some inherent word of mouth. Because technology businesses are inherently scalable. One website you open for e-commerce in 99, it can serve pretty much the entire country from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, and you can send your products to entire country, which basically mean that you end up having a business that is thousands or hundreds of thousands times bigger than a small offline business. And when you want to serve that kind of large audience base, the only scalable way to reach out to those customers is when a customer talks to other fellow customers and starts becoming your product, brand, company, advocate, whatever way you want to call it. So every business has to have an inherent word of mouth. Just marketing is never going to be enough for you to reach out to all the customers and make them aware that I'm solving your need.
Sure. Let me just ask you one more question, which is that at the end of the day, when you really look at it, what people see, or what, let's say, a prospective customer sees, is only an online presence. On the other hand, what goes behind it in terms of engagement with bus operators, integrating with their booking systems, ensuring that the delivery actually happens, all of that stuff. How do you make sure that that part is managed as well as actually acquiring a customer?
A business is more like a spider web. It has got multiple strands which all fit together well, and strength of the spider web is basically something that comes by these interconnections than anything else. So at the end of the day, a business, if you treat it like a spider web, has got multiple activities that you're doing in your business, some to serve your suppliers, some to serve your partners, some to serve your customers, some to serve your employees, some to serve your investors. And at the end of the day, you have to figure out all the strands which fit in together and do them the best possible way. So you have to build the best product for your customer. You have to build the best product for your supplier. You have to build the best product for your partners. And only if you have got the best product, then there is a possibility of having a word of mouth and customers talking about your product further to other customers. So probably having the best product is the first and foremost thing that goes in achieving this state that you're talking about.
So may I then conclude that what you do online is no different from what somebody else does offline? As far as your business operations go, you have to make sure that it is the best like anybody offline does it.
100% I agree with that viewpoint. I don't think fundamental styles or business fundamentals never change. It's only the way of doing things change. And yesterday I talked about my approach of classical businesses which are led by wisdom and the new age businesses which are led by the learning or the speed at which you learn by way of experimentation. I think it's only a difference in the style of doing things. Fundamentally the business principles are the same. You have to do the same thing. It's only how you do it changes.
Good. So I think that's one very important lesson that, just because you got a website, just because you got an online commerce engine, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can afford to ignore the fundamentals of a business. So the fundamentals of business have to be in place and very strongly managed in the event that you want to make a successful business out of it, whether it is offline or whether it's online. Vaidi, you've had a long history in this first-hand experience of building online, building offline, and then subsequently building online businesses. So if you were to reflect on now since what, 97, 98? 99 till when you recently decided to move into an advisory role, over the last 15, 16 years, if you were to reflect on it, and then see the things that are happening around you today, what are some of the early warning lessons that you can provide based on the lessons that you have learned?
Can all of you hear me? Okay. So, I certainly agree with what Alok is saying, that the fundamentals of business don't change irrespective whether you're online or offline or integrating online and offline. Unfortunately, they seem to have changed. In other words, a lot of the things that happen today, if I was an investor in some of these businesses, I would be absolutely frightened. I would be frightened because a lot of these businesses at transactional level don't make money, and to me that's an early warning sign. Businesses take time to mature, businesses take time to make money, and I don't have a problem with it. But I think if you're building a business where the fundamental transaction level doesn't make money, I would be absolutely frightened to scale that business, because all it means is going to lose more money. And when the entire focus, so the focus of a business must be, like you mentioned, create value, deliver value. But if the focus of a business, and that seems to have changed, is to primarily get more funding in and not necessarily create value. And to me, selling at a discount is certainly not creating value, it's actually diminishing value. Those are early warning signs. Unfortunately, those signs have been around for so long that I'm not even sure I would call them early anymore.
May I just interject one clarification? What is value? What is your definition of value?
So my definition of value is very simple. You have to create a product or a service that the customer is willing to pay for, right? So you take raw materials inside your business. They could be capital, they could be resources, they could be people, they could be materials, and then you put them all in some kind of, as far as possible, mysterious recipe and deliver it to the customer, and the customer finds the whole product and saying, I'm willing to pay X rupees for it, and that X rupees must be such that the company, after paying for all the materials, has money left behind. Then I think you have created value, A, for the customer, because the customer is willing to pay for it, and B, you have created value for the business, because the service has left some value back for the business. To me, that's a definition of value, and I'm not sure the definition is being followed properly today.
Okay. So may I redefine that as profit, for example?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, at a transaction, so profit...
Why I'm asking this question is because in the current set of terminologies, value seems to mean something and profit seems to mean something else. I can see Alok picking up the mic, so I'm sure he's also got a point of view on this.
Yeah, so I'm sure he's got a point of view. I think if you're not creating value, you can't ever make profits. But they're not the same thing, because the value happens at a transaction level, the profit happens at a financial level. But fundamentally, if you're not creating value for the consumer and for the business, the only way you can make profit is to pray.
Sure.
I just want to make one comment there. I think value is not profit. Value is something which allows you to make profit. And I'll give you an example of that. Half of you will start laughing after this. Who do you think is the greatest entrepreneur of our time? In my view, the greatest entrepreneur of our time, of today's time, is actually Baba Ramdev. Baba Ramdev basically taught us pranayam for 10 years of our life. And during those 10 years, he built amazing amount of trust on him, where he taught us pranayam for us to live better, for us to live a healthy life, instead of paying him direct money. He didn't make any profit, but what he created was a magnificent value in that process of 8 to 10 years. And that process of creating value is now allowing him to create profit, whereby he has created a 2,500 crore worth of FMCG business out of that. So that's a beautiful example which always comes to my mind in terms of if a business is doing something, it should create value, and that value allows you to create profit. Business does not necessarily need to create a profit in the short term.
Sure. So in the classical, consumer terminology, what you'd always say is that brands create value, business creates profit, and in valuation terms, as you can see today, there is value created in companies. So, that's why I just try to clarify, just to make sure that everybody here is on the same page as all of us when we discuss words like profit and value and, long-term valuation, short-term excellence. Sorry, Darpan,
I had a follow-up question there. How do you differentiate when you're selling a product, right? They're all resorting to discounting. I'm selling a service, so I can differentiate. It's a service. Each service provider provides the same service slightly differently. But when you are Flipkart and Amazon, you figured out the logistics and you figured out having the right merchandising in place, and then they're fighting on discounting. So how do you then create that secret sauce that you were talking about? Yeah.
So in my view, if you're selling the same product or service, it's almost impossible to differentiate, especially on large scales. Perhaps the only way is to differentiate by user experience. In other words, all of us on this table are selling exactly the same product at exactly the same price, or maybe all of us selling 1 rupee lower. The fact of the matter is the customers will evolve and move and gravitate towards somebody who's delivering the best experience. Otherwise, there's no choice. And to me, that's the big challenge, because the reason why, like I was telling you, it's hard to make money is because it's hard to differentiate.
Okay. Vaidi, I think you should just send Darpan a bill for professional consultancy services provided. Since he's in the services business, he thought he might as well get free advice from you. Rishabh, you've been in this, in the business of retail for a very long while. I think from both manufacturing to retailing to several things. And when you see the time that you've taken to be able to build a business, which will hopefully realize a market value very shortly. And then when you compare yourself to, say, Sandeep, who's sitting on your left, who's built an online business and taken much lesser time than you have, what are some of the things that you could contrast between the two? And Sandeep, the next question is actually, the same question is to you after this.
We've been in the business now for the last 20 years. We were discussing earlier in our group that it takes, anywhere between 5 to 15 years to create a business and create value over a period of time. So I think I belong to the traditional set of retailers or people who, believe in commerce and value transactions. These businesses take time. You evolve as the markets continue to grow and stuff like that. Definitely what we are seeing is technology has been a game changer over the last few years. So people entering that are taking advantage of poor infrastructure, growing consumerism, youth getting more familiar, smartphones coming in. But at the end of the day, businesses will survive either if you're able to differentiate or you're able to provide value. So to that extent, the fundamentals of doing business, whether it's online or offline, I believe will continue to remain the same.
Sure. Sandeep, what's your view on this?
When we started Yepme, so I think the first thing we thought that I'm from Meerut and we thought why brands are not reaching here, what we've done wrong. So why we are queuing against, the tailored shirt, same tailor giving promise of 15 days. Then later, with experience and we realized that brands are not there because they don't make money here. And then we thought about online fashion and we said that if that is the reason that brands cannot make money here, they can't reach, why we should not think about creating brand online. And today, the offline brands, if you look at, they're reaching 150 to 200 cities max. And while we are delivering to 1,000 cities, on a cumulative basis. So I think the whole thing is that offline retail will remain. And the reason is that, the whole customer experience in terms of touch and feel and, the other benefits which offline gives you, it will remain. And even the biggest economy, the offline retail is still 90% and online is just 10%. So offline retail will remain. The online, the advantage is that the reach is, very good. The second thing is that the kind of range you can present through online, you can never do in offline. The third thing is that it becomes a very efficient distribution channel if there is a brand and if there's a pull. So the challenge for us was basically how do you build brand, in an online, space where you don't have showrooms, where there's no interaction, where there's no touch and feel. And I think we have crossed this barrier. And today, if you look at Indian space, the biggest Indian offline brand was not even touching 1,000 crore, while it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And if you think why that is the case and why Zara has become, so fast it has grown, it has only 14 or 15 stores and it's become almost #1 single brand in the country. You think it is beyond the penetration or the unit economics. I think the second question which comes is that what is your proposition? And just like Zara, which is into fast fashion, we are also now becoming online Zara. That is our proposition. And the differentiation is through fast fashion. Because beyond a point, you will start competing with what Myntra is offering and Jabong is offering. And if you get compared with them for any reason, at least on pricing, then you are dead. Because we cannot afford discounts. We are not driven by discount. We are driven by creating brand. We are driven by our range. We are driven by our fresh fashion promise. So we thought that if we have to create a differentiator and if the online fashion brands are going to become, online fashion portals are going to become competition, then we need to have differentiation without channel. So our differentiation is fast fashion. If we continue to execute and scale on that, then probably will become India's not only the first online fashion brand, but the biggest brand in India very soon.
Great. Atul, you've been, you and I have been part of several of these conferences before words like online was, was prevalent. And you started off, building both an entertainment business, but more importantly also building a mall business.
That's right.
And you've seen the changes that have happened in the last few years, especially with online commerce having come in. So when you look at, let's say, what you were managing in terms of physical spaces, housing brands, which used to sell to customers who walked in through shopping doors, versus what is happening today, can you kind of sometimes compare and sometimes contrast as to what are some of these changes?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually run a couple of malls and some of them are fairly successful. I think you can draw parallels between online and offline space. Even when we are evaluating online businesses, I think those businesses are going to be successful that actually manage a small set of customers initially so that they service them well. And it's not really about growth, it's also about durability. Are you getting repeat customer to an online venture? So same thing's really happening in offline when we run successful malls. So small set of audiences are coming to those successful malls because we are servicing a particular need. They're repeat customers. It's all about durability. We are not able to achieve those kind of growth that probably an e-commerce company can achieve. But what a mall is doing currently is it's a durable, it's really giving customer what he needs. It's giving him a great experience. He's coming over there. He's repeatedly getting to shop with similar kind of brands that he's wanting to buy. And it's a repeat similar experience. It's a homogeneous experience. It's something he's used to. What's happening in the online world, it's really about growth, and profit seems to be a pedestrian word, and people are just focusing on growth without profits. I think that's not going to be a long-term sustainable model, because coming back to the same point, and as Maiko, as Alok also mentioned, it's about defendability, it's about durability. You need to get those customers back. It's like when Groupon started operations, it engaged with a lot of customers, a lot of merchants signed on. But it was hard for them to get them back to use that service over and over again. So I think it's really about keeping those customers, having those repeats, and I think that's what the physical world does successfully. That's what the fundamentals of business are. I think online needs to catch up with those fundamentals of the business, which is durability.
Great. And I think the other comment that I've often heard is that, when you shop in a mall, you shop with a family. It becomes a social experience. Whereas when you shop online, you shop individually, and it remains a transactional activity and not an experience. So there's obviously a difference also when you actually shop online.
Experience as well, yes.
That's true. Okay, Bharat, the last question before we throw it open to the audience, and we come back again to the panelists after that. You've been in the M&A space, you've been in the private equity space, evaluating opportunities to buy, to merge, to invest, etc., with the Aditya Birla Group. So when you really look at, let's say, opportunities that you've seen in the past, and I'm sure you've been involved with the acquisition of more from Vaidi when you started the retail business at Aditya Birla. So when you look at, let's say, the opportunities in terms of acquisition and investment in the early days, when there were only physical businesses that you could acquire, versus the digital businesses that you can acquire today, and purely from a financial perspective, have you seen a sea change in the way expectations have changed, and how some of the realities are probably being modified to suit today's expectations?
So that's, I think, Viju, very interesting question that you ask, because I guess, Vaidi sitting next to me, I think, we started at Aditya Birla Group our business by acquiring Trinetra Retail from them. So, personally, I think my approach to whether looking at an asset as a strategic person or as a person who is going to be investing as a private equity, maybe it is peculiar, I think has not been very different. Because eventually, I think what you are buying into is a business. And what is that business delivering for me? And what is the objective that business is delivering for me? So look at it, I think, from an acquirer's perspective, as a strategic acquirer. I think if there is a gap, so say something like, when Trinetra was acquired, I think it was more of an entry strategy. And the fact would have been that, how much time is it going to take me, for constructing something similar, which is a new age business, versus I think something which is already on the ground, and there are learnings already there in that kind of a business, and how I can build upon that faster. So as an acquirer of a business, I think if you are intelligent about building upon the learnings that you acquire along with the business that you acquire, and then being able to scale it up and reduce the tracking error, as I would say, in terms of the mistakes that might have been done in the past, and you might make newer mistakes. I think that remains the rationale for a strategic acquirer to go and acquire a business. Say at that point in time, it was only offline businesses, I think, that were available. So the second dimension is that as an investor, I think when you go and sort of probably look at it, my approach always has been is that I am doing an acquisition, maybe I am not acquiring majority, but I am still actually acquiring a business, and I am going to be owning a piece of it. Is that 10%, 20%, 30%, does not matter, because we were not control private equity investors. And the yardsticks, I think, that you would use, to evaluate that business would be not very different. Is to say that what's the problem that you are solving for the customer? And it could manifest in two ways. Is it a defined sort of a problem, or it is an undefined problem? And if you would go back, so something like when a shampoo sachet was introduced, there was no defined need, for a customer. It just got introduced because someone actually evaluated that to say that, and I would like to bring another perspective that for 20 years, I have heard this, that there is this 200 million middle class customers, which is a big pot of gold. And that number keeps growing, and maybe, today I think after 20 years, that number might be 400 million. One important learning in 2 decades has been that this particular segment is very price sensitive. It also sort of gets very validated between this offline and online debate. That you are selling the same product offline, you are selling the same product online, but probably online you are selling it cheaper. And hence, all these customers that were sort of not present, you were not visible, are suddenly sort of thronging your all online shops and then buying from there. So there's a big learning for all of us in that this entire mass segment that we talk about in India is very price sensitive. So is that the secret sauce that we have to, without compromising on the quality of the offering, you still have to maintain that price point for your customer, and the customers will be very happy to come and buy. So as I said, for an investor, I think still, these are some of the fundamental questions that you would ask about why this business exists. And to my mind, the financial metrics only become secondary. After that, then you see that whether this business is sustainable, scalable, in a profitable manner. And these are not either ors. I think these are all three, which are very important. Again, from a very selfish motive of an investor, from an exit perspective, if I invest in a business which is scalable, which is sustainable, but in my tenure of 5 years or 6 years when I'm seeking an exit, it doesn't become profitable, where would I exit that business? And hence, if not profitable, it should be very clear that in the last 2 years of my exit horizon, that business should have visibility to profitability and very clearly sort of identifiable and measurable kind of measures of profitability. So as I said, that some of the disciplines I think remain
the same,
similar.
Good. So what we'll do is we'll just throw it open to the audience for a few questions, and then we'll come back to phase 2 of the panel discussion, which then dwells in a little more detail on concepts such as omni-channel, the theme of this conference, which is phygital, all of those areas, so that we get a better sense of what we're speaking about. So I saw the gentleman here.
The conversation you guys had. As someone who's been watching and commentating on the stock market for the last decade now, my mind boggles at the valuation models that have been set up for the internet business. I mean, none of the traditional rules of game apply. There's no asset to sales, there's no debt to equity, there's no time sales. If you were to, for our audience, build a valuation model, and I know you said that financial metrics don't apply, but ultimately it is about making money, right? What 3 or 4 valuation models would you set forth, or pointers would you set forth while looking at a company and trying to value it appropriately? Things like Snapdeal and Flipkart have higher valuations than some of our hotel chains. There's no physical asset involved, and I think that's what people are trying to get their head around on how to value these businesses.
There are actually 2 frameworks that can be put in here. One is if the business is actually a late stage business, then you come into all these questions about the valuation framework, whether you are putting in a discounted cash flow or you are putting in more of a fundamental analysis of the business and you're doing a valuation of the business. But the real question is, if the business is a really early stage business, what is the number that you have access to? You don't really have the cash flow access to the business, you don't have the profitability, you don't even have revenue in most of the cases, because typically in an early stage business, the revenue is more like maybe 10, 15 lakh or 20 lakh or so. At that stage, you don't really have any kind of a model that can predict that this business is going to be doing this much in like 5 years from now or those kind of things. So how do you do a valuation? Actually, then it just becomes like more of a heuristic valuation and those kind of things. So it becomes more of a matter of, if this business becomes big, how big it can become. And if the opportunity is like $10 billion and this business can grab 10% of that market, it become like $1 billion business. And in order to achieve that $1 billion state, how much money this business needs now? For reaching that stage, let's say the business needs $50 million to reach that stage. So you'll actually pump in $50 million and you will say that, hey, you know what, if I take entire ownership of this company, then the entrepreneur who is working into the company will not be motivated to work at all. So you don't want to dilute the entrepreneur too much. So maybe you'll take like 30% of that company. So that naturally leads to the valuation of about, say, 120 million, 140 million, those kind of ranges. Because so as you can see, the framework is much more of a behavioral economics framework and those kind of things than a real mathematical model per se. So the model is really how much money is required to realize that opportunity, and I don't want to dilute the entrepreneur too much. There's another framework that is sort of applied here, which is that there are generally two kind of businesses. One is a Pujari business. Second is a Shah Rukh Khan business. A Pujari business is basically you sort of do puja and you earn for that much amount of effort. And the more amount of hours you are actually able to do puja, you are able to earn more. But a Shah Rukh Khan business is you do shooting for one movie and you make like 500 crore out of that, or maybe 200 crore out of that. So what I'm basically trying to point out is that a Pujari business is a non-scalable business. You scale linearly. You scale that business in a linear manner. Whatever amount of input you're putting in is the proportionate amount of output that you'll get out of that. But in a scalable business, the amount of input is actually going to create a disproportionate set of output, which is what happens in a Shah Rukh Khan movie. So internet businesses are typically scalable businesses and offline businesses are typically non-scalable businesses. Offline businesses are more Pujari business and internet businesses are more Shah Rukh Khan businesses. Which is also why every Pujari makes money, but there are only very few actors who make money. But the actor who makes money makes shitloads of money. Now if there are probably like 1 lakh aspiring or actors who will be landing into Mumbai every month or every year, but only a couple of them end up reaching the state of Shah Rukh Khan. Now, if you have to support all those actors, you'll actually see how much this actor will actually make at the end of the day and make investment accordingly. Right? So these frameworks are much more of behavioral economics frameworks than mathematical frameworks.
Good. So you got two answers. One answer is that you've got a model which you can define as a Pujari model and the Shah Rukh Khan model. And the second answer that you've got there is that the future is always brighter than the past. And if you believe in the future, invest in it. That's right, exactly.
I'll just add, I mean, to me, valuation is all about future cash flows of a company, and how do you determine that in a space which is just very nascent. So I would just break it down to how much value is derived from each customer, and then scale it up and see whether that there is a market large enough to get to millions of customers. So I would see what the cost of acquisition of a customer is versus what I'm going to earn through the lifetime of the company from that particular customer. If it's greater than acquisition, then it makes business sense. And then I would see how many customers could I get of those kind of customer. And then accordingly, I would see what the valuation metrics could be. That could be one of the way of evaluating such company.
Good. Sorry, gentleman in the first row. Can you just introduce yourself, mention your name and then the question?
Okay, hi. Am I audible?
Yeah.
My name is Nikunj Bubna. I am an entrepreneur who actually has been running a bootstrap business for some time. Having raised a few $1 million just recently and being offered a little more than I would actually need in the short run, I believe, I am facing a dilemma which stems from two schools of thought. One which says that if money is being offered, just take it. You might need to create margin of safety. It might be handy for some other unplanned activities in future. And there's the other school of thought which actually I believe in, and I'm a little confused on that because it says that, the moment you're overfunded, you start making mistakes, the inefficiencies creep in, and perhaps that's where, you stop innovating as hard as you were bootstrapped. So which school of thought does the panel actually, gravitate towards?
So whichever school of thought, I have one answer. If you have anything in excess of what you require, please give it to me. I'll keep it with me till you require it.
You already have enough.
Sorry.
Maybe I can help with that. So both frameworks are right. The right perspective in my personal view is to build a perspective on how the competitive situation is going to emerge and whether your product is a defensible product or a product is a differentiable product like we were talking about earlier. If your product is a defensible product, then don't worry about raising too much money right now. Build only as much as you need and you will always keep getting money because your product is a defensible product or business. If it is only a differentiated business, then build a perspective on how much money your competition is going to raise. And if you think your competition is going to raise a shitloads of money, you may actually end up being in a state where your funding sources are actually cut. Nobody further will invest in your business. So in that case, it is better for you to raise much more amount of money than your competitor does. Otherwise, the better thing is actually to raise as less amount of money as possible. Does that
Good.
answer your question, or I confuse you?
No, I think it gives him a broad framework. Sorry, can you get the mic from him? From Mr. Bubna? Just raise your hands in case you want to ask a question, okay?
I'm Varun Khurana. I have been an employee and I'm now a channel partner with Indian Oil. My question is to Darpan. Darpan, you are enjoying your offline avatar more or the online avatar? And to Rishabh, do you think the role for channel partners is diminishing with online sales coming up for Adidas and other brands?
Let me put it this way. In the online avatar, I have not slept more than 4 hours a night. In the offline avatar, I was getting about 7 hours. So both are extremely exciting. I mean, for me, it is the journey of creating something, creating a company, whether it was the offline one, whether it's the online one. Everyone said the business fundamentals remain the same. So that doesn't change. How you go about it probably changes. So both are great. I mean, I love both of them. So enjoying both equally.
So there's a new Einstein's theory there, which is equal to sleep equals money. Okay? So if you want a lot of sleep, you won't get that much money. But if you want a lot of money, you won't get that much sleep.
Oh, absolutely. Continues and grows as well.
Yeah, I think offline will definitely continue. Online, most studies are showing is somewhere in single digits right now. A lot of studies are putting it at about 10%. I'd like to sort of look at when organized retail came into play, a lot of people in the unorganized sector felt threatened with this, with the advent of organized retail. I think after 15 or 20 years, organized retail is just about 10-12% of the overall size. So I think there's enough space for everybody to continue to grow. I don't think it's one at the cost of the other.
Just one interesting add-on. The investor in Rishabh's company was also the investor in my offline business, and he is also the seed investor in my online business. So I guess it's all coming together.
It's a lot of incest. Okay. Yeah. Any other question? Sorry. Can we, Mr. Gupta, can we have a mic there?
My name is Adarsh Gupta. Since the internet has come into daily life of consumer, we are seeing a new generation well-qualified entrepreneurs aged between 21 to 34 and setting up startups and trying to challenge and compete with business run by very experienced people, mostly in the age group of 40 to 65 years, who have been running well-established businesses since last 20 to 100 years. The major difference between the two types of entrepreneurs, in my view, is the new generation are very knowledgeable, exposed to high technology, and very transparent in business and approach and their dealings, whereas the second generations are although very experienced, but very little knowledge of technology and generally not at all transparent. So my question is, do you think, all the panelists, if there is a marriage between the new generation and old generation, and they jointly start new businesses, respecting the knowledge, experience, and skills of each other, there can be a win-win for both, and also, more importantly, for the consumer?
Correct. So that's the reason why, after many years of running companies, I decided to become a strategic advisor, because I believe that now with no hair and a little bit of gray hair, I certainly can add value to some of these youngsters who have a lot of hair. Sorry, so we can, anybody specific that you want to ask this question to? From a business model, I think if you should ask them a question, it should be Rishabh, because he's pretty much in the same space that you're in.
Well, I agree on the age part of it.
One part of it is that you look young, though you might fall into a slightly older category.
40 and above category. So I think, yeah, you said it correctly. I think youngsters today understand technology much better. But I don't necessarily agree from a transparency and this thing perspective. I think it is a good idea. And that is why a lot of omni-channel terminology is now being looked at. Because eventually it will be a marriage of both online and offline. which will work the best?
Well, there's one research which has conclusively proven that when you look at those who exit out of college, the level of creativity and innovation is the highest in the first 7 years post getting into your first job. And then slowly over time, creativity and innovation starts declining. So it's not just about, so probably that gets replaced by experience. But even if you do look at a company and you look at management trainees who come in, they ask sometimes what we might think as the most stupid questions. But really when you reflect on the kind of questions that they're asking questions which all of us should be asking. So I think there is also what tends to happen at a very early stage in a person's career. That is when they're most fertile in terms of imagination and creativity. And because of that, their ability to be able to dare the unknown, in that sense of the word, and think of doing things which others might think as highly risky is also very high. That's one part of it. The second part of it is that till about 30 years back, if you wanted to start a business, you pretty much had to hawk everything that you had. Because, you had to give collateral to the bank was the only source of finance, etc. But now with the entry of, what I might define as non-formal, but private equity in some sense of the word. So whether you look at it from an angel investor perspective, whether you look at it from a VCP perspective, there are other sources of funding. And these sources of finance are actually looking for the bright, defensible ideas, if I were to borrow Alok's term, in order to be able to make a difference. And that's, I think, where this marriage is happening between young, bright minds, no fear of the unknown, and also the fact that they are able to access a lot of, non-bank financial sources. Sorry. Any other questions? Sorry, one question there.
My question is related to one of the
Could you just mention your name also first?
Yeah, my name is Nishit Shah. My question is related to one of the discussion which was being held, wherein it was mentioned that for the retails which are limited to few cities only, and online one can have access to several cities at a time. But at that time there is a big challenge also along with that opportunity to reach to several cities. Is of the logistic part. So can you please throw a light that how much challenging it was to manage the logistic part in terms that you are in a particular city and you are getting the orders from several different cities, and on the other hand when it is a store, brick and mortar store, and they have to serve them the customer who is in front of them. So how much challenging it was in terms of logistic point of view?
I don't think brick and mortar solves the problem of getting it in the real time, because at times you like the product but the size is not available, and it has happened to all of us. So I think online solved at least that problem, because everything is real time and you don't go through issues of size missing and all. The logistic part I don't think is a problem right now, because there are enough couriers which have come in which cater to different cities, and last mile is covered by India Post. So we also do India Post, because most of the online companies, they are not doing India Post. Now the question with India Post is that the experience is poor, and there are issues in real-time tracking and collection, everything. But if you look at the consumer who is sitting there, he's not getting any better experience anyways, right? But you are giving him opportunity to at least buy a good he or she likes and get delivered. Experience may not be as good as a tier 1 city experience, but at the same time, the basic fundamental we have adopted is that we will cater to each and every pin code of the country by choice, and the experience is a function of expectations and expectation setting. And if the expectations of a person living in that remote area are aligned with what you are promising, then I don't think there's a challenge. And the way the courier companies are getting investment, we are very confident that within probably a couple of years, every pin code will have a same delivery experience like tier 1 or tier 2 cities.
So let me just give you a slight macro view on that entire thing. If you look at offline retailers, the largest amongst them gets to at the most about 200 cities. 200 cities are out of 4,500 towns and cities in this country. 200 cities contribute to approximately about 22% of India's population. Okay? And if you were to do a conjecture on the retail market size, urban India contributes to approximately 45% of India's retail market. So you can assume that this might be about 30% of India's retail market. So what I think Sandeep's mentioning is that, and what Rishabh also earlier alluded to, is that the potential is still very large for consumption. But physical retail, because of the fact that it's present in certain cities, will only be able to serve that and the surrounding cities. So the opportunity for consumption, if you believe exists beyond these top 200 cities and you want to make a business out of it, then there is potential available. Now you've got to figure out how to be able to reach them. And online gives you the opportunity to be able to get your message, which is why all these drivers about number of people who are, internet connected, etc., all that comes up, so that gives you an opportunity to get to reach them, transact with them, and as long as you can make sure that you have delivery models which can deliver to them, they can actually participate in the market just like any, offline consumer can participate in the market. So I think that's the larger understanding that you need to take out of this. Sure. One last question before we go back again to the panel.
Hello. This is Lalit Agarwal. I run a chain of store called V-Mart Retail. I just wanted to contradict Alok and also contradict the gentleman. We run 110 stores over 92 cities. The model is scalable. It's not that only internet companies are scalable model. Retail itself is scalable. The concept is scalable. It's all about how much belief do you have in your model, and it's all about how much expansion can you handle, and how much growth can you handle, and what kind of organization can you have, and what kind of funding can you get. And are you creating value by creating profitability? Are you creating value by creating profitability, or are you just creating value by creating numbers? So we just need to understand that. I'm sorry.
No. So I think you've reinforced what I've just said earlier, which is that potential is available. You got to make sure that you are able to reach the potential. If you constrain yourself physically to certain cities, you won't reach the potential. In your model, what you've done is to be able to first go into tier 2, tier 3 cities, created a model which is relevant to that set of people in those kind of cities, and then to be able to expand into a larger number of cities is certainly possible.
And I think the whole India is there to consume, and consumers are there everywhere. It's all about us to understand their consumption pattern and be available with those products. And the whole India is the market, as you said rightly, that for the 4,500 towns or greater than 4,500 towns are there, which are serviceable by offline retailers, and market is there for everybody to be in. And there are not more than 200 cities where organized retail is available. So there is a huge opportunity for everybody to go and service. It's all about how do you want to be there. And logistic, I don't think there is any challenge. It is easier than what a internet company's logistic can be handling. It is more easier for a store to handle those kind of logistic. It's almost similar. Even online companies have stock out, and offline companies can also have stock outs. So it's almost similar. It doesn't have any difference. Anyway,
sure. Just the gentleman there.
Yeah, hi. My name is Ashish Tir. I have a question related to the exit. You mentioned, I think, in your presentation as well, especially for the Ps and VCs. Not only in online, online, so we only hear about, entries and valuations. Even in modern retail, we haven't heard many exits in India. And my question is related, how do the Ps actually ensure, apart from, of course, sitting on the boards and saying that we'll help with the talent, because, you want to exit at 2x, 3x, 5x, in some cases 10x as well in 3 years, 5 years time. How do you actually make sure that the business make money? What is your role, apart from advising and more on the GAN side, making sure at the operations level that the business is able to make money for you to be able to exit at 3x or 5x?
So, one part of it is giving the Gyan, as you mentioned. The second part of it is going and meeting that Pujari, whom Alok talked about, and making sure that you have a prayer every morning with the Pujari saying, please help me exit. It's easy to enter, but it is very difficult to exit. And I think that's a reality we all need to know that is happening. So I'll ask, Bharat is one who's entered and exited several times over, so I'll leave him to answer.
How many Pujaris he has met?
So I'll just add, I think, because just the speaker, from the audience who just spoke just now before you, He is a person that I had backed his company 7 years back, right? And your question about what we would have added, you can have an offline discussion with him on exactly what we added. I think, but just for more sake of records, they were very specific, I think, kind of framework that we sat along with the founders and figured out on retail what is going to be sort of effective and profitability. Idea clearly, and that was an alignment with the founder and the investor, that we are not building only top line. I think we have to build a profitable business, and for that, if we have to slower down the trajectory of the growth for some time, so be it. It doesn't matter. And the music to the ears was that even the founder actually played along with that, to say that that's what actually he also wants to do. And the outcome of that was that I think even at something like a $50 million kind of an entry market cap, we listed that company, I think 2.5 years back when markets were not as buoyant. And that testifies the fact that what a private equity investor can do is to ensure that the company is on the right path on the traditional metrics that you have to use, which is growth profitably and ethically. And in addition, you bring them out to the market at a point in time when markets might not be most buoyant. But if you have built the company right way, you will find backers, right? And we listed the company, and after that, I think another set of private equity investor came in a year down the line, and he owns a significant chunk of that company. So if you build the company right, you can help them. And yes, on the exit front, in terms of listing, founder, needs to be supported, because some of these times, the founders will be the first time entrant in the capital market. So they need to be helped on that, on what exactly I think are the peculiarities. So that's one example. Second one, is a company where Alok's fund, and my previous Aditya Birla private equity fund had invested together. And again, I think we ensured that about 6 months back or a year back, that company got listed. Again, it's not a $1 billion company, $200 to $50 million kind of a market cap company in consumer. And the company is sort of trading very well even after the market sort of listing has happened. So in terms of more importantly than creating exit for ourselves, for these kind of companies, what we would have done is that we have created a liquid currency. So the next round of growth, they don't have to be dependent on anyone. They have a liquid currency. They can go out to the market, access the markets, and fund their growth. I think those were a couple of points that I wanted to make.
Sure. Thanks, Bharat. And I think we're running out of time. I've got several reminders saying that we're running out of time. Sorry. What I would suggest is that if you could engage with whoever you want specifically after the session is over and ask them the question 1:1.
I think it's about the online channel. It's in the interest of the entire.
Yeah, but I guess we will have to cut this. We don't have 2 minutes. Okay. We've got 20 seconds. So which is why I'm saying your question will be more than 20 seconds. So you should ask them on a 1:1 basis. So what I'd like to do is, I know there are so many questions that we can ask about this business, either the business of actually funding or the business of being funded. And there are several people here who've been funded and managed to exit from the investments that they made, as well as who have actually built investments, made investments, built companies, and then as promoters they've exited out of these companies. So there are enough to talk about. So I would recommend that you all engage separately. So first of all, thank you very much to my panelists for being, creating some engagement in a space which is certainly not very interesting when you talk about finance, but I think everybody understands money. So to that extent, it's made it a little more interesting. It's unfortunate that we didn't have enough time to be able to ask all the questions to all the panelists, but we did try to do whatever is possible, and we gave the audience a lot more time than what we had originally budgeted, because we knew that there would be lots of interest. So thank you once again for being a part of this audience and for being part of the panel, and thanks a lot.